Hello, everyone, and welcome to Magma Rages episode 66. I have Pandemonia with me today, as always. And it's been quite a quiet week in terms of Hearthstone. So, there's not much news. The meta is kind of ebbing and flowing as we expect at this point in the expansion. So, we've got a couple decks to talk about. We've got an interesting and always controversial topic to talk about. Skill versus luck and how we showcase skill in Hearthstone. And then, of course, we've got our usual esports segment. But Pandemonia, how has Hearthstone been going for you in the past week?
Yeah, not too bad. Like now that it's reaching like the end of the season, a lot of people are obviously there seems to be a lot more aggro as people try to race to try and make legend before the end of the month.
Yeah, I actually don't think it's really that. I think it's because of just the ebbing and flowing of the meta. Like Quest Rogue's seen a big rise, at least
Oh
particularly at
yes.
Legends. So that's kind of the counter to that has been people playing more aggro decks. And I think that's really where the popularity of aggro has come from. I don't really think it's an end of the season thing. Um,
Okay.
and like that's really the way that the meta is or has been evolving in the last couple of days or last week. I mean, we spoke a little bit about Quest Rogue last week, and it's kind of now I think is not the right time to play it anymore. I think that there's too many decks coming in that are actually good against Quest Rogue now, with a lot of the faster decks. And we actually are going to be able to, or going to be speaking about some of those decks. The one deck which is not all that new of a deck, but is one of the best decks that we can recommend to climb right now, is Deathrattle Hunter. Deathrattle Hunter, the new cards we see in this are the Spider Bombs and the Giggling Inventor, pretty much. And then because of the ever presence of Giggling Inventor, we also have a Mossy Horror tech in this deck. It works really well because sometimes in the late game you also have those eggs lying around that haven't been popped yet. And so when you play the Mossy Horror, you can also get some 5/5s for yourself. So that can help make for a powerful tempo turn. And then this particular version also has the single king crush over instead of like the double Savannah high main that's sometimes played. Personally, I like that because I think it gives you some burst against some of the other decks like Druid, for instance. It's pretty decent as well against like the warriors, like the odd control warrior we spoke of last week, right? Getting King Crush
Yeah.
for that extra burst can be pretty relevant, especially off something like Katharina. And then it's also got a Gluttonous Ooze. There's actually quite a decent amount of weapons running around in the meta right now. And that helps you in quite a few matchups. So, I think overall the deck shell is pretty solid. And it has pretty good matchups against some of the popular decks right now. I mean, I think you played a lot of Deathrattle Hunter before the Boomsday project. How do you feel about the deck?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I haven't played much since the new editions, but like the deck, it had a lot of like it was one of those quite flexible mid-range decks because of like cube shenanigans. You could
Yeah.
do you could go really aggressive in terms of like you cubing your eggs or like your high mains, your big threats, but it could also go build a big wall when you cube something like your Witchwood Grizzly,
Yeah.
where you could just put up a stack of big taunts.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of the more versatile decks, but I think it does get a little bit punished by really aggressive decks.
Yeah.
That's kind of the one. That's kind of the deck that the decks that kind of punish it a little bit. I think.
Yeah, I mean, the best tools it has against those is often like the candle shots, and the spider bomb helps a lot against some of those decks because it's one of the ways you can actually win back tempo on the board immediately, rather than the kind of delayed tempo you get with the Devil Saw eggs. So sometimes, spider bomb and a play dead on the spider bomb instead of an egg can sometimes set you up better, especially if you can avoid giving your opponent, let's say, easy trades into your 5/5s that you might spawn otherwise. So I think the deck has a decent amount of flexibility. And I mean, Witchwood Grizzly is one of the best things you can ever hit against those really aggressive decks if you can last that long. So
Yeah.
I actually think it does better than some other decks against decks like Odd Rogue, which is actually the next deck we're going to be speaking about. And if you don't have King Crush, it's definitely playable without the King Crush. You can just pop in a second Savannah Highmane. Or if you really want to tech hard against Druids and Giggling Inventors, you can play the second Mossy Horror as well. And I mean,
Yeah.
on that topic, the epics that we have, the Mossy Horror is kind of a tech card. The Ooze is a tech card. So you don't have to have both of them, although the Mossy Horror is definitely something I'd want to have right now. And Cube is probably something you do have to have for this deck.
Yeah. Cube is kind of only the really important epic. In terms of also, I think a tech card you could maybe consider including is like something like Blood Knight as well. Because I
Uh,
mean, basically,
yeah.
I think between Blood Knight and Mossy Horror, those are basically the current techs for Giggling Inventors.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll see the Blood Knights actually in the Odd Rogue um,
Yeah.
after this.
So obviously, the choice. I mean, I think there are some decks that run both Blood Knights and Mossy Horrors, but obviously a lot of the times they'll
Yeah.
run one or the other.
Yeah, I think Blood Knight is more often played in the odd decks, basically. Mossy Horror is arguably the better tech card, actually, because it hits the Spreading Plagues as well, rather than just the Giggling
Yeah.
Inventors. And that's pretty relevant because there's still quite a lot of Druid. And this is a deck that does perform quite well against Druid because it's pretty easy to build your board pretty tall. And especially when you're generating 5/5s from the egg, they're going to match up well against Spreading Plague. And if you're fortunate enough, you can build a board of 5/5s, watch them Spreading Plague, and then follow that up with a Mossy Horror and kill them. Which happened to me as a
Yeah,
druid
I
today.
think Mossy Horror though is generally better in like mid-range to slower decks, whereas Blood Knight seems to be better in like the more aggressive decks because
Sure,
Blood Knight has a bigger sort of tempo swing on the board in
sure,
terms of
sure.
you also put a big body instead of a
Yeah, yeah.
2 set.
And you don't kill your stuff. The difference with Mossy Horror is Mossy Horror is better when you're actually behind. You don't have stuff on board. Blood
Yeah.
Knight is better when you have stuff on board, but the Divine Shields are just making your life a pain. That's basically how it
Yeah.
goes. And also, obviously, the more aggressive decks are at the moment odd decks, so you can't play Mossy Horror in those decks. So your only real option is Blood Knight.
Yeah. Well,
And
you can. It's just probably not advisable.
yeah, and I mean we've been speaking about it enough, so we may as well look at this odd rogue now
Yep.
with the double Blood Knight tech, and still the double Giggling Inventor. Sometimes you can even just make a big Blood Knight off your own Divine Shields, like with the Argent Squire as well. Otherwise, a pretty standard list. No Maya's Unstable Element anymore. So I mean the only legendaries we have are Leroy and Baku. I think this is definitely a very good deck to play towards the end of the season now if you're looking to climb and on more of a budget. I mean, Blood Knight's probably the one card that is a questionable craft if you don't have it. Being is that it is
Yeah.
only a tech card, and the Vilespine Slayers are pretty solid if you have any aspirations to play Rogue, really.
Yeah, I mean, the rest of the cards are basically quite generic in any aggro deck, or
Yeah,
like or rogue as a whole.
yeah,
I
or just
mean,
yeah. I mean, if you look at
Baku,
like
Leroy, we're not really going to,
yeah,
these like nah, it's probably safe crafts.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, cards like Giggling Inventor and Vicious Fledgling, as you say, are pretty present in just lots of decks, particularly aggro decks.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, what kind of tips would you have for people playing Odd Rogue?
So like odd rogue, I think some of the sort of less common tips. I think it's actually sort of how common it is to go like turn 1 drop, turn 2 1 drop, then cold blood your other 1 drop. I
Sure.
think is sometimes I don't know something some people miss or
Against,
don't think of
yeah,
when
the
playing the
one
deck.
time I
Yeah,
think in particular that's really useful is against like even Warlock. If you can cold blood like an Argent Squire or cold blood like a Diamol or Firefly, and then not set up for the Defile for the easy clear, you can get in a lot of damage with that cold blood, and that can make a
yeah.
big difference against the even Warlocks. I think
Because I think
mulliganing is one of the other tricky things with this deck.
yeah,
A lot of the time you don't want two 1-drops. So like if you're not on the coin, if you're going first, let's say, and you have a 1-drop and like a Hench Clan Thug and another 1-drop, you pretty much just want to decide between those two 1-drops and mulligan the other one most of the time.
yeah.
Because you'd much rather dagger on two a lot of the time. And I think, it's just like figuring out that curve is one of the more difficult things. Like figuring out which 3-drops you keep in certain like class matchups is also pretty relevant.
Yeah, I mean, but I think like we spoke about before, knowing what to expect and then what sort of expected removal.
Yeah.
So like a lot of the times, sort of, let's say your dream curve would consist of like one drop into hero into like weapon up into like Hench Clan Thug, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you have the coin, but like sometimes, for example, it's actually I think quite a strong play to, let's say, even though it's a little bit off curve, to coin something like a vicious fledgling, because if you know that you're against a class that can't deal with it easily, everyone knows a Flappy Bird can basically just win the game
Yeah.
straight up,
Like
like outright by itself.
yeah, like Druid is a great example where Vicious Fledgling excels. I mean, that's a popular class in the meta right now that doesn't really deal with the Vicious Fledgling very well.
Yeah, outside of like spellstones, and like if you can like just get it that extra turn ahead and allow you to either get the can't be targeted stealth or the extra health,
Yeah, yeah.
that's a long way towards just winning the game, single-handedly winning the game.
Yeah, I mean, I had a game just now and later before this where I had like the vicious fledgling and I just kept hitting health. Like I couldn't hit Wind Fury. I couldn't get like attack. It was kind of bad in a way, but eventually it just worked out because I had this unkillable 3-9 with like the Deathrattle was the other thing I got on it. And like that just worked because like they couldn't kill it and they tried clearing the rest of my board. It still stuck and it was just always a threat. And so, I mean, that can be really powerful. I mean, that was against Cube Warlock, where, I was obviously trying to play around all the different removal they could have. So, yeah, I mean, one of the
Which
other
is quite
things is like,
difficult though.
yeah, one of the other things is like Blood Knight. I don't think it's a card you would almost ever keep in the Mulligan, um, unless, like, I actually can't think of any deck I would keep it against. Maybe Paladin's the only one because they have like maybe two Divine Shield 1 drops. But most of the time, it's something you definitely want to mulligan for, the other 3 drops, like even Blink Fox most of the time, because Blood Knight, as we kind of mentioned, is something that's great in response to Giggling Inventors, so it's not something you want to hold in your hand. Like the big
Yeah.
thing with this deck is to make sure that your first 3 turns are solid. Often that's just going to be 1 drop into hero power into 3 drop. But if you have that, then you can build the rest of the game from there. You can build such that you hit that Fungal Mancer. I think hitting Fungal Mancer actually has probably a pretty high win rate, I'm guessing, in this deck, because of just
Yeah.
how much power it enables you to get on the board and how much damage it allows you to push as well.
I mean, especially if you like fledgling on something like a vicious fledgling, right?
Yeah, yeah, if you hit that Fungal Mancer on the Fledgling. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think this is also a relatively cheap deck, as we mentioned. So it's definitely a good deck to go out and try if you haven't. Not the most innovative thing, but right now I think it's in a good place in the meta, and that's why we're talking about it now, and that's why we are suggesting you try it or Deathrattle Hunter out. Okay, so moving on to our other major topic for today. So seeing as it's a bit of a quiet week news-wise, we're going to be discussing somewhat of a controversial topic in Hearthstone. It was like almost over a month ago now that there was an article released, sort of opinion piece about showcasing skill in Hearthstone and how we kind of don't really do that enough, I would say. And, with all the expansion news and all that, we kind of shelved that discussion for a little bit later. And so now this is the later. So, I mean, Pandemonia, like, I think you were the one that linked me that article at first. Kind of, let's just talk briefly about what you think you get out of the points that were trying to be made in that article, at least.
So basically, like it comes down to there was a guy wrote an article, and it was basically talking about how Hearthstone it wasn't featured at some esports award, but like he went on more to elaborate the fact that like there's a lot of Hearthstone players, pros, and even just casual players that don't really regard Hearthstone as like a serious esport, if you will,
Mm.
because of like the RNG. And then, people always obviously bring up like some of the really lucky moments where people have won lost games. Like for example, a lot of people remember when Pavel beat Amnesiac, and the joke was Pavlian book.
Yep.
And so his article kind of highlights the fact that we kind of always, and the emphasis is always put on when people get lucky to
Yeah.
win, more than when guys played well, or when people played skillfully or planned well to win.
Yeah, and I think
And
uh, that's a very easy mistake to make as both an audience and as like casting talent as a community. Because it's great. Hearthstone is a game that does have crazy moments, and those are the ones we really want to talk about. There are a lot more of your like showstopper moments rather than something like making a good trade to play around Defile or to play around a Hellfire or something like that, or talking about the specifics of the mulligan in the different matchups and how he actually like increased his percentage chance to win by like 10% by choosing to mulligan away this card that otherwise looks pretty good in this matchup.
yeah, and I mean, sometimes the thing is, sometimes the casters might point it out sort of as hindsight, but the problem is, it's one of those things of it's not as easy to explain, but also obviously, like you say, it's not as appealing to your audience. It's not like if I use I use CS:GO as example. Like if
Mm.
you watch a game, like even with a very limited knowledge of CS:GO, if you watch and one guy, aces another team, you can kind of go, that was a pretty key moment, and that's
Yeah.
how that team snowboard, and won.
Yep.
But like in Hearthstone, most of the times where you do have those moments, they center around people getting lucky rather than being, like you say, the skillful plays of playing around cards or setting up lethal over several turns. And
Yeah.
so that guy's article kind of emphasized the fact that we need to be trying more, I think, consciously, whether as players, as casters, as a community, to try and give more recognition and to try and appreciate and make people aware of, like, the skill that is actually involved, right? To try and
Yeah, definitely. The skill that is involved in having a consistent or consistently performing well in Hearthstone. I mean, I think that's the key. It's not something new to Hearthstone. It's something that has been present in pretty much all card games. That variance is a factor. Simply just draw variance before you talk about anything else is a factor. Hearthstone does do what it can to mitigate that. I think we've spoken about that a long time ago, about the difference of like not having to draw lands means you mitigate your draw variance because you don't get like mana screwed or mana flooded, for example, comparing to something like Magic. So it has certain things like that. And then, to make up for that in terms of enjoyment, it does have other kind of RNG factors like, good old Dr. Boom back in the day, rolling the
or
one
just
to
random
four
effects.
on the
I
boombox,
mean,
or just random effects like your
Blink Fox.
blink fox. Yeah, that's a good example. So I mean, there are those kind of cases where sometimes like you said, the babbling books that give players the exact cards they need to win, but most of the time it's really just about the player's decision making in the game, and that's really difficult to highlight. Certainly, as casters, it's difficult to know exactly what the person is considering. So the best you can do is always just to kind of speculate, and that's quite difficult because you're speculating for both sides. Even though on one hand you kind of have caster vision and you can see what the opponent has in the hand, that doesn't actually help you get any insights into the decision making of the other player, right? Knowing the knowledge doesn't help because you have to look at the decision from the player's perspective that doesn't know the knowledge, and they kind of get both turns to think about their own turns. Whereas as a caster, you have to kind of talk about both turns and you have to kind of explain things in a way that makes sense. It's much easier to think through a lot of possibilities in your head than to find nice ways to explain them to an audience. So, there's certain things like that make the casting side of it tough. But it's more than just that. It's also like as a community, when we talk about tournaments, we don't really talk about the big great plays. We talk about those like lucky moments, and
exactly.
it's partly things like even with aggro decks, right? Like we all like to meme to say face is the place, but a deck like Odd Rogue is a lot more nuanced than just going face. If you just go face consistently, if you just dagger up on 2 and go face with your weapon on turn 3 and 4, you're probably going to lose more games than you win by just doing that. Because very often decks like that are really just about controlling the board and making the best
Yep.
use of your resources to snowball early, which is not always easy, as it does get punished quite heavily when you get it wrong.
Yeah. So I mean that's the thing. So the other aspect that I think we mentioned is the fact that the reason why it's also such a contentious topic is because like it's always easier to blame. It's easier to say, oh, I got so unlucky and lost, rather to
Yeah.
say I made a mistake and I could have played better.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
much like in other games, you sometimes blame ping. Uh, you know, in Hearthstone, like, and so the thing about it is, it's one of those. A lot of times, it's like there's a bit of there's a bit of truth in both aspects of it. So
Yeah.
sometimes, and I mean, I'm guilty of this as well. Sometimes you will legitimately get a bit unlucky, right?
Yeah.
Like you will, but like if you think about it, you're like, okay, cool, I got a bit unlucky, but there were steps you could have taken in the previous turn, to potentially increase your odds by a couple percent, or to play around certain things a little bit better.
Yeah, exactly.
But like I think the number one thing, and like something to make sure that you always, to try and always learn and improve, is whenever you lose, and even if you go, oh, it was the most unluckiest,
Yeah.
always look at it critically, and kind of ask yourself, you know like, okay, cool, at the end of the day I did get unlucky, but could I have taken reasonable steps beforehand?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
obviously, you can't, obviously you can't play around like, for example, let's say, like I was mentioning Blink Fox, or like, like certain like sort of random effect into random effect, you can't take into account. But
Yeah.
a lot of times you kind of, I think you would be honest with yourself to say, okay, you know what, I could have actually played around that a little bit better, you know. But
Yeah.
sometimes, at the end of it, sometimes it's really like, okay, I mean, which game,
Yeah, I mean,
which
you're talking
DreamHack
about kind
was it?
of random things with very, very low probability, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like back in the day, losing to like a crazy Yogg-Saron, right? I mean, you could ask yourself, like, could you have finished the game a bit earlier so that they didn't get to the point that they could play that? Could you have pushed your advantage when you had it a little bit more rather than playing so cautiously that you eventually lost to this like unlucky or this, high roll from your opponent, as you would put it. So I think it is very important. As you say, if you want to improve as a player, the key is to look at the factors you can control and do as best as you can with those. Look at them
Yeah,
saying, like, these are the choices I made. What were the alternatives? And would the alternatives not have necessarily won this game, because you can't look at it as a results oriented case of like, oh, because he got Hellfire, I should have played this 4-4. But because of the whole possibility of cards he got, should I have played the 4-4 versus, let's say, the 5-3? Which was going to lead to a higher win probability over the, total possible, like, let's say, random cards that they got from the Blink Fox. And that's kind of where the key comes in. And that's a really difficult skill, actually, to kind of look at a situation and get some kind of idea for the grasp of, like, what are the possible outs they can get from this random generation card? How could I possibly lose this game? Those are kind of big thinking skills, your meta skills in Hearthstone that are actually, or sorry, macro skills, I would say, in Hearthstone that are actually very important and can go a long way to mitigating those scenarios where you go, oh, damn, I just lost because my opponent high rolled.
yeah, and it's been able to, like you say, it's one of those things I think we spoke about a while back about. It's also about knowing, like, I think from experience, being able to kind of feel and know what position you're in. Can you afford to play around,
Yeah.
like random things or not? And like a lot of times, if you, let's say, in a comfortable lead, and you've got a lot of resources, it is sometimes worthwhile to think, okay, what random things do I lose to, instead of trying to set up lethal for, let's say, 2 turns, but I can lose to the following combination. If I'm so, confident, why not just play a little bit safer? And even if I win and take an extra turn, it might be safer so I don't lose to. I mean, one of the ones that stuck to my head is, I think it was one of the season championships where the guy played around, like, I think as a rogue. No,
Mm-hmm.
it was basically the guy played around like a stolen Leroy Jenkins.
Okay.
I think it was like a tempo rogue versus priest, and basically the guy had operative, and the guy playing rogue was constantly playing in such a way that he was playing he didn't know that the other guy had Leroy, but
Yeah.
because he kind of, it was sort of in the back of his mind, he constantly made plays to play around a Leroy, and it turned out that the opponent did in fact have Leroy, and he was constantly just a couple points off lethal.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a kind of case where you've got that high stakes. You really do go through the possibilities as a player. I know, like, I'm very guilty of this on ladder where I don't really consider all the possibilities. And then, they get that hellfire or from the Blink Fox. And I'm like, oh, geez, I forgot about that. I didn't think about them getting, eviscerate for lethal, or I didn't think that they were going to steal my Leroy in that case that you're talking about. Because on ladder, you can sometimes get very lazy with those things. Because of
Yeah.
the just quantity of games you're playing, and I think
Yeah.
that's where you do see in tournaments you get that where players have a lot more on the line for that single game, so they're going to take things much more slowly and carefully in those scenarios. But
Yeah.
it also comes down to matchup knowledge, something we've mentioned before, knowing when you can afford to take it slower, or whether you're actually increased or like decreasing your chance of winning by taking a less risky path.
Yeah,
Um,
and knowing like that you're on a proverbial clock, right? In
yeah,
terms of knowing, okay, like against the Warlock, it's a case of can I beat them? I have to either beat them before Blood River Gul'dan, or can I, outlast and beat them afterwards, right? You kind of have to,
yeah, exactly.
make a decision.
Yeah. And I mean, something that people have often pointed to in particular was the, performance of top players, saying, oh, there's no players that are consistently winning tournaments, or there's no players that are consistently, getting very far in tournaments. And that has definitely been dispelled a lot lately. We've mentioned Hunter Ace before on this podcast, but he's a great example. Muzzy's another one. If Muzzy ends top point scorer for North America, or for the Americas again this year, like for last call, that I think is 3 years in a row that he would have done that. That's ridiculous consistency. That's consistency over 3 years of just doing so well in point turning events. And I mean, if you look at the Europe points for this season, I mean, Hunter Ace has like 85 points this season, which is, I think, 20 or 25 points higher than the next player. 25
I think
higher
it's
than
like
the next one,
Fino,
which is
isn't
Bunny
it?
Hopper. No, well,
Oh,
Bunny
it's Bunny
Hopper for
Hop.
this season. No, not for like
Oh,
the whole HCT year overall. And I mean that's just crazy. That's not just ladder. That's not just like, oh, he finished first on ladder every month. Although that would be a crazy achievement. Anyway, he did get a lot of really top ladder finishes, but also, I mean, we've seen his tournament performance and how dominating he's been in the last, or pretty much this whole year, right? So I mean that really helps dispel that myth that you don't even see it at the top levels of play. And I think that's a good thing for the community to see that. You just have to look at things with a little bit more of kind of a, you have to take a step back and look at it overall. I mean, for those that watch like Dota as well, I mean, we saw this last weekend for the international. Spoiler alert if you haven't watched it. OG winning there, and they were considered one of the big underdogs, expected to go out probably before the top 8 by most people in the tournament, and they ended up winning it overall. So the kind of idea of like the underdog, or maybe the quote unquote less skilled team or player winning is actually not that uncommon in other esports as well. It's just a little bit more of a case in Hearthstone and card games in general because of the variance. So we have to look at player performance over time to really get an idea for who's up there as one of the greats. And speaking about player performance and tournaments, that leads us nicely into our esports segment for the week. HGG is back. I will have to say I'm been guilty of not really watching much of it. Once again, due to the lack of interest of having any teams from our continent playing, kind of doesn't really excite me as much. And the HCT playoffs, though, that is coming up this weekend. So, we were talking about a Hunter Ace getting points. He's going to be the first seed for that. This is the playoffs to determine the European players that will be going to the HCT Summer Championships. So for the next 3 weekends, we're going to be having playoffs. Europe first, then NA, and then Southeast Asia, I believe, or APAC, sorry. So yeah, make sure you tune into that. It's going to be on Saturday and Sunday. I think it's going to be on Saturday and Sunday for all 3 weekends. So this weekend starting on the 1st and 2nd of September. So that's going to be some really top level Hearthstone that we're going to be able to watch. And the Europe one's always nice because it's on our time zone as well. So that makes life a little bit nicer for us. So I'm definitely looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's really, it's good quality Hearthstone, and I think honestly the best thing about a lot of about watching these competitive tournaments is listening to the casting, and and sometimes they can give you that insight because sometimes some of the casters can pick up and say, oh, the
Mm.
reason why he made this sort of seemingly unusual play is because he's setting up for lethal or because he's playing around this. And some of the casters sometimes they kind of get it, sometimes they miss it, or sometimes they're just outright wrong. They chat to the player afterwards, and the player had a
Yeah.
completely different line of thought.
Yeah, yeah. But that's definitely a good place to check it out if you want to see some of these top players in action. And good luck to everyone involved there. Hopefully, we get some absolutely stellar Hearthstone in what's going to be by far the biggest tournament of this Boomsday Project meta. And we can see already there's like a kind of split between those players bringing your kind of quest rogue anti-control lineups and the players bringing very aggressive lineups. So that's going to be interesting to see who comes out in the top for like the whole tournament overall. I haven't really had a look at the total deck demographics. I can't think of a better word for that now for the tournament. So it's difficult to say which lineups are better. But right now, the aggro lineups are looking like they can really punish those anti-control lineups. So yeah, make sure you yeah.
Some of it sometimes, also come like sometimes, going back to a little bit of the orange, sometimes the groups you get put in, because sometimes, you kind of plan for the right meta, but then, you get put in a group with just the wrong decks, right?
Yeah, I mean the summer, the playoffs is just a Swiss tournament, so sometimes you can get those bad pairings as well. So you could have the lineup that might be best for the average player in the tournament, and then you hit like three people with let's say the rare aggro lineup, if that's the case, and they all beat you, and then you kind of 0-3 and unrecoverable in a Swiss bracket like this. So it can be really tough going. There's those kind of things like because of the inherent polarization in matchups, just getting the wrong matchups can also be another factor. So you have to kind of look at how, let's say, a lineup performs in general, not just which lineup won, to determine what is kind of the best lineup for that given meta of that tournament, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, make sure you check that out. It's been a relatively short episode again this week. If you have any decks you want us to discuss, any other topics you want to hear our thoughts on as well, feel free to comment on the YouTube video. You can also tweet at us. You can find Pandemonia down there at PandemoniaZA, and you can find myself at Dib_gaming. Was that Nexus event this last weekend, or was that this weekend coming up?
Yeah, it was this past weekend. Yeah, we got 8 players in total, but yeah, we're hoping to host the next one, the next month. And for those of you interested, my current plan is to actually make it a Whizbang tournament.
Okay.
Because a lot of the people at this previous one seem to be very keen on the idea. So yeah, keep an eye on social media out for that if you're keen in the Joburg or Gauteng area.
Yep. Keep an eye on Pandemonia's Twitter down there. And if you are somebody in the Hearthstone South Africa Facebook group, keep an eye on that as well. So thanks a lot, everyone. Once again, feel free to reach out to us for any feedback you have. And obviously, like, share, subscribe, do all those things that help the channel grow. Thanks a lot, everyone. Cheerio.
Cheerio.